There were some very important Supreme Court decisions issued this spring, issued in June. And I think if you took a vote of which one were the most anticipated, the two that were the most anticipated were the decision on Obamacare and the decision on same-sex marriage. The Obamacare decision came first. The case there was King versus Burwell. And I have no intention of talking about Obamacare in terms of is it a good idea, a bad idea, et cetera. As you know, on this show, we don't really take position on issues. We talk more about process. But the decision, King versus Burwell, made me think about the legacy of dysfunction and the legacy of polarization that is related back to Obamacare. And I thought we should spend some time talking about it because the Democrats and the Republicans have been as polarized on this as any issue as I've ever seen. They don't work together, and it's as contentious as any issue. And I think in the end of the day, some of this has come back to actually hurt the Republicans in the decision-making versus King versus Burwell. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I thought we should review just how contentious this has been, how dysfunctional it's all been, and how polarized it's been. Because whether or not you like Obamacare, whether or not you support Obamacare, there are issues that suggest it's not working to its optimal. And there are also suggestions that it didn't solve all the problems that it was meant to solve. A lot of people ask me how I felt about Obamacare, and I said, I think it's an important issue to think about health care for everyone. But if you think about that and you don't deal with the cost structure, you don't deal with tort reform, you don't deal with some other elements, and you only deal with half the picture, so to speak, you really haven't done justice to the problem. So that's been part of my concern. But again, for today's purposes, I thought we'd revisit how this got to be so dysfunctional and then talk a little bit about where I think the Republicans made their mistake. So let's take a look at the whiteboard. So we've got Obamacare, King versus Burwell was a recent decision, and what I'm calling here a legacy of dysfunction. Let's take this one side at a time. Now let's start with the Democrats. First of all, as far as I can tell, Republicans were not included in the design of the Affordable Care Act. So again, health care is a very important issue. The scope of the issue is very pervasive. And as far as we can tell, the Republicans just weren't really included. Now, the Democrats may have initially tried to include them and decided it wasn't worth it. But for whatever reason, the Democrats really did not include any of the Republican suggestions for solution sets in the final legislation. There was a rushed vote. Speaker Pelosi is very famous for having said that no one read the bill before they voted on it. If that's not the height of dysfunction, I don't know what is. Following the passage of Obamacare, and by the way, Obamacare has actually been on the books now for over 5 years, I believe. We've had multiple executive fire drills. Now, in this case, when I say multiple executive fire drills, I'm talking about the decisions that have come down from the president himself, the executive branch, that have forestalled the implementation of Obamacare. I still don't think Obamacare, the implementation of Obamacare has been extended to businesses that have over 50 employees. Now, the Obamacare model was built on a certain structure of how the system was going to be paid for, and the system wasn't ready for the larger employers, or at least that was the decision the president made, and he literally imposed an extension that was inconsistent with the law. The employers of over 50 employees was supposed to have taken effect, and it hasn't taken effect yet. The president just single-handedly said, we're not doing it. I don't know if there's been a subject of litigation yet. There's been a lot of litigation around this matter. But the fact that we would have these type of what I'm calling executive fire drills, again, shows you that the rush to vote, the rush to judgment, the rush to not include the other side in decision-making has ended up with an act that hasn't played out as anticipated and an act that has had a lot of problems. And then finally, there have been no legislative efforts on the Democratic side, as far as I am aware, to fix some of the problems. So at this point, all of the solution sets, these executive fire drills, are all coming from the president's and the agencies running Obamacare. They're not coming from the legislature. So this is very dysfunctional, very polarized. Now, the Democrats have done a good job of, again, being dysfunctional and polarized on this issue. The Republicans, I think, have done even a better job. So let's look at their side of the ledger. We said the Democrats didn't include them. I don't think the Republicans ever wanted to participate to begin with. My take on this And again, this goes back to the president's, the very beginning of the president's first term. I don't think the Republicans wanted to allow the president to have any victories. This was seen as an important issue for him, certainly an important issue for the country, healthcare. And the Republicans, I think, wanted it to go bad. They didn't want to be part of it. They didn't want to offer solutions. And in the end, they didn't vote on it, but I think part of their not voting on it had the fact that they also weren't included. So there's a push-pull there of the dysfunctionality. All they've done really since then is to attack, and really have not offered solutions. We went through one presidential cycle where Mitt Romney was a Republican candidate. He had invented the equivalency of Obamacare in Massachusetts, and yet he had to run from it in the Republican primaries and never really got back to it in his run for the presidency. So again, the Republicans didn't participate. They were not part of the solution set. And ever since that time, they've been on the attack. Part of the attack has been repeal after repeal. Now, the Republicans have had control of the legislature for the past, I think, 3 years, if not longer, and they have not offered any solutions of their own. They've just tried to repeal Obamacare. A couple of those repeals, I think at least one has reached the president's desk. Some of them were held up by the fact that the Senate was Democratic. Actually, I misspoke. It was not for the last 3 years. It's just been in the current cycle. But the House would, after repeatedly send repeal to the Democratic Senate where it would die. I think that's a total waste of time. You repeal it once, maybe, and that's it. You've sent your message. But here, multiple repeals, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of energy, just emblematic of dysfunction, once again. And a lot of this had to do with the judicial strategy. I think the Republicans felt that, and still feel, that the courts got it wrong, but they felt that the courts were going to overturn Obamacare as being unconstitutional. And in the most recent decision, the King versus Burwell, they felt that they had found a major flaw in the draftsmanship of the Obamacare, and that flaw was going to cause a whole series of subsidies to fail because they were not appropriately structured in terms of how the exchanges work. So to me, this is just, again, emblematic of dysfunction. You've got Democrats who rush to judgment, don't include Republicans, and then try and fix problems outside the legislative process. And you have Republicans who obfuscated, repeal after repeal, and we're looking for judicial solutions. I think, again, this is perhaps the biggest symbol of dysfunction and polarization that we've had over the last over 6 years now of this president. And I think the only Republican solution that's being offered right now is that if they elect the president, and if they keep control of the Senate, and if they keep control of the House, they're going to repeal Obamacare. Again, I don't know if that's the solution the country wants, but that's the only solution the Republicans seem to have in mind. Let me go so far as to suggest that this may have had an influence on the decision at King versus Burwell. The Burwell decision was not about constitutionality. It was about judicial construction. It was about whether or not the particular statute itself worked. Many people thought it was poorly designed, and because it was poorly designed, the court was going to decide to say that the subsidies should not exist. I don't think that's how courts normally like to work. I think courts normally like to find solution sets themselves, and in this case, they'd already signaled in the original case upholding constitutionality that they thought this law should exist. It was constitutional. And I think the failure of the Republicans then is that they never offered a solution. The court could never see a solution. To a certain extent, all they ever offered the court was either this law is going to fail in its entirety or it's going to succeed in its entirety. And that being the case, I think the court decided they would allow it to succeed in its entirety. This, I think, is a failure of the Republican strategy. But again, as I said earlier, their strategy is to repeal. And if they elect the president and if they still control the Senate and the House, I think that in 2017, you will find that they will repeal Obamacare. It doesn't mean, however, that the system is less dysfunctional. It doesn't mean the system is less polarized. In fact, I'd like to suggest that will only add a layer to the dysfunction and only add a layer to the polarization. It would be much better if the legislature could come together and solve the problems together, work with a new president, whichever party the president's from, and make Obamacare work to fit within the constructs of the constitutionality and the legislative decisions that we've been given by the courts.